The quiet before the storm. Anaya Carter, a senior cybersecurity operative for the National Intelligence Bureau, NIB, was widely known as the woman who could crack the most sophisticated codes and dismantle the most dangerous cyber threats. Her name was rarely mentioned outside classified circles, but within the agency, she was a legend. Anaya's expertise had prevented financial collapses, terrorist plots, and breaches of the nation's most sensitive systems. On an overcast Wednesday morning, Anaya drove a modest, unmarked sedan through the outskirts of Edgewater, a quiet suburban town known more for its scenic parks than crime rates. The vehicle, lent to her by a fellow agent, blended perfectly into the mundane suburban environment. Anaya herself dressed for anonymity. Faded jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a lightweight bomber jacket. Despite the casual attire, she exuded a sharpness, her eyes scanning every detail around her, a habit honed by years of high-stakes missions. The meeting she was heading toward wasn't just important, it was critical. An advanced cyber attack, suspected to be the work of an underground syndicate, had breached a secure national system, threatening everything from banking systems to national defense. The consequences of failure were unthinkable, and Anaya's expertise was the linchpin in resolving the crisis. She had spent the last 48 hours dissecting data, identifying vulnerabilities, and preparing countermeasures. Now she was on her way to brief top officials at a secure facility. As Anaya drove, her thoughts were consumed by the intricate details of the case. She replayed snippets of intercepted messages, recalculated probabilities, and mentally rehearsed her briefing. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional jogger or dog walker breaking the monotony of the suburban calm. The gentle hum of the car engine and the faint patter of rain on the windshield were almost soothing. But something gnawed at her, a subtle, instinctual unease. It wasn't the urgency of her mission. Anaya was used to operating under immense pressure. This was different, an intangible feeling she couldn't shake. Her training had conditioned her to trust her instincts, and now they whispered that something was out of place. As she approached a stoplight, her gaze darted to a parked police cruiser on the opposite corner of the intersection. Two officers were inside, casually chatting, their posture relaxed. On any other day, Anaya wouldn't have given them a second glance. Today, however, her eyes lingered. The unease grew sharper, though she dismissed it as pre-mission jitters. The light turned green, and Anaya pressed the accelerator. As she crossed the intersection, she caught a flicker of movement in her rearview mirror, the thin line between authority and prejudice. The overcast sky darkened further as the confrontation escalated. Anaya stood motionless, her hands resting on the cold hood of the car, her mind calculating every possible outcome. The officer's aggression was misplaced, their suspicions unfounded, yet here she was, being treated like a common criminal instead of the highly trained intelligence operative she was. Her calm, calculated demeanor only seemed to infuriate them more. The taller officer, whose name tag read Henderson, roughly yanked her jacket off and tossed it to the ground before stepping in closer. "Why are you driving a vehicle that doesn't match your registration?" Henderson demanded. His partner, Officer Dale, remained behind him, one hand still resting on his holstered gun, as if she were an imminent threat. "I've already explained," Anaya replied, voice unwavering. "This is a government-issued vehicle. I can provide credentials." "Where are they?" Henderson interrupted. "In my jacket," she said, gesturing towards where it lay on the pavement. Henderson glanced at Dale, whom nodded before retrieving the jacket. He reached into the inner pocket, retrieving a sleek black leather ID case with the embossed gold emblem of the National Intelligence Bureau, NIB. His brow furrowed as he flipped it open. "NIB," he muttered, almost as if he didn't believe it. He scanned her photo, her name, her clearance level. Then he looked at her. His expression hardened. "Never heard of it," he scoffed, snapping the case shut and stuffing it into his pocket. "Nice fake." Anaya's jaw tightened. A slow, simmering frustration built in her chest, But she kept her composure. "That is a classified government identification. I strongly advise you to verify it before making baseless assumptions." Henderson let out a short, dry chuckle. "Is that so? And how exactly do you suggest I verify a badge from an agency that I'm pretty sure doesn't exist?" "You can contact the Federal Operations Center," she said, forcing herself to remain diplomatic. "They will confirm my identity and clearance level." Dale snorted. "Sounds like someone's been watching too many spy movies." By now, a small crowd had gathered, a mix of curious onlookers and concerned residents. Some had their phones out, recording. The middle-aged black woman in a navy blue blazer, likely a local, took a step forward and called out, "Officers, is everything all right?" "Step back, Mom," Dale barked. "Official police business." "Doesn't look right to me," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Anaya noted the shift in the atmosphere. The officers were no longer just dealing with her. They were dealing with the weight of public scrutiny. Then things got worse. "Ma'am," Henderson said, stepping in closer, "I'm gonna ask you one more time. Where did you get this car?" Anaya had had enough. "Check the glove compartment," she said coolly. "You'll find the official clearance letter for this vehicle, signed by my superior at NIAID." Henderson hesitated before motioning to Dale, who yanked open the car door and rummaged through the glove compartment. After a few seconds, he pulled out a sealed envelope marked classified. "Federal use only." Dale examined it, then shot Henderson a look. "It's got an official seal." Henderson snatched it, his expression shifting from smug arrogance to uncertainty. He inspected the document, flipping through it. Then, as if desperate to hold on to control, he scoffed. "Anyone can fake a letterhead." Anaya exhaled slowly. This was beyond incompetence. It was willful ignorance, perhaps even something more insidious. "If you refuse to verify my identity through official channels, you're making a serious mistake," she warned, her tone edged with finality. "You're obstructing a federal agent on active duty." Henderson squared his shoulders. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Anaya replied, holding his gaze. "And if you don't believe me, I suggest you call your supervisor, because in the next few minutes, this entire street is going to turn into a crime scene. But not because of me." Henderson's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but before he could respond, the radio on his shoulder crackled. "Dispatch to Unit 7. We have an urgent inquiry from Federal Operations regarding a missing agent. Description matches the subject in your custody. Immediate response requested." A hush fell over the street. The color drained from Henderson's face. Dale stiffened, glancing between his partner and Anaya. Anaya's lips barely lifted at the corners. Checkmate. The revelation that changed everything. Henderson fumbled for his radio, pressing the button with a shaky hand. "This is Officer Henderson. Can you confirm the request?" The dispatcher's voice was sharper this time. "Henderson, you are currently detaining a federal agent assigned to a Level 5 national security operation. Stand down immediately and await further instructions." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The woman in the blazer gave the officers a look of pure disdain. Dale took an uneasy step back, no longer gripping his gun. Anaya remained motionless, arms crossed. "Looks like you just made the biggest mistake of your career," she said, her voice quiet but cutting. Henderson swallowed. His jaw clenched. That can't be right. She wasn't in uniform, and the car. The radio crackled again. "Henderson, we are patching in a secure line to your precinct's captain. Do not move. Agent Carter, are you unharmed?" Anaya tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes. "For now." A long silence stretched between them before Henderson slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out her ID. His hand trembled slightly as he held it out. Agent Carter," he said, his voice unsteady. There was a misunderstanding. Anaya took the ID without a word. "Yeah," the woman in the blazer muttered loudly from the crowd. A misunderstanding. Right. Henderson turned sharply. Ma'am, I'll need you to. But the woman already had her phone raised, recording. Too late, she said, her expression sharp. Whole world just saw your misunderstanding live. Henderson paled. Anaya's radio beeped. A deep, authoritative voice came through. Agent Carter, your extraction team is en route. Do not engage further. We have this handled. Anaya smirked. Henderson and Dale had no idea how much trouble they were in. As sirens blared in the distance, signaling the arrival of her backup, Anaya finally spoke. You should have just checked the Dan ID. Then, without another word, she turned, stepped into her car, and waited for the fallout to begin. The reckoning begins. The sirens in the distance grew louder, their echoes bouncing off the quiet suburban streets. The gathering crowd parted slightly, making way for the black SUVs and unmarked government vehicles that now approached with a commanding presence. The tension in the air thickened as more police officers arrived. Only these weren't the usual beat cops. These were internal affairs, and from the urgency in their movements, they already knew something was very, very wrong. Henderson shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his misjudgment finally settling on his shoulders. His partner, Dale, stood frozen, his face pale as he realized that whatever they thought this was, it had escalated far beyond their control. Anaya remained by her car, arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but internally, she was seething. She had been through a lot in her years as an elite cyber operative for the National Intelligence Bureau, NIB. From infiltrating international cybercriminal syndicates to preventing large-scale national security threats. But this was personal. Being detained for a bogus traffic violation wasn't just inconvenient, it was a blatant misuse of power, an abuse of authority rooted in prejudice. And now, the reckoning had arrived. The arrival of power. The first car to arrive was a sleek, black, government-issue Suburban with tinted windows. As soon as it rolled to a stop, the doors swung open, and out stepped Special Agent Logan Pierce, one of the most powerful figures in federal law enforcement. Pierce wasn't just any agent. He was the director of federal operations, a man who answered only to a handful of top officials in Washington. And from the look on his face, he was furious. Behind him, 3 more agents stepped out, each wearing dark suits, earpieces, and a demeanor that screamed authority. Pierce took one sweeping glance at the situation. Anaya standing by her car, the crowd filming, the officers still holding their weapons, and Henderson looking like a man who had just realized his career was over. Who's in charge here? Pierce's voice cut through the murmurs. Henderson took a step forward, his confidence crumbling. I'm Officer Henderson, sir. There was a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Pierce's voice was dangerously calm. He turned to Anaya. Agent Carter, are you all right? Anaya gave a small nod. I'm fine, but I'd rather talk about how these officers obstructed a federal agent on an active national security mission. Henderson paled. Sir, we didn't. Pierce cut him off with a glare so sharp it could have sliced steel. You detained a senior federal operative, ignored her credentials, and failed to verify them through the appropriate channels, Pierce stated coldly. And that's just the beginning of your mistakes. The crowd murmured louder now. The woman in the navy blue blazer still had her phone pointed directly at Henderson, capturing every humiliating moment. Dale finally found his voice. Sir, she was in an unmarked vehicle. We thought. You thought what? Pierce interrupted. That an unarmed black woman in a government vehicle must be a criminal. The accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud. Even the other local officers, who had arrived on the scene, looked uncomfortable. Anaya watched as Henderson's face flushed with guilt, but it was far too late for regret. Pierce turned toward the arriving internal affairs officers, who were already stepping out of their vehicles with clipboards and body cameras activated. I want these officers' body cam footage immediately, Pierce ordered. And I want a full formal inquiry opened. Now. The lead IA agent, a stone-faced woman with a cold efficiency, nodded. Already in progress. Sir. Henderson tried to defend himself. Sir, we didn't mean any harm. We were doing our jobs. Pierce stared him down. Your job, he repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass and detain innocent citizens, let alone a high-ranking national security officer. Then came the final blow. Pierce turned to the IA agents. Place officers Henderson and Dale on immediate suspension pending investigation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Henderson staggered back as if he had been struck. Sir, please. Save it, Pierce snapped. Because when the Department of Justice gets involved, you're going to need a very good lawyer. The unraveling of a lie. As the internal affairs officers began taking official statements, the energy of the street shifted. The police force, once the symbol of authority, now looked powerless, exposed before the very public they had sworn to protect. The woman in the navy blue blazer shook her head. This happens all the time, she muttered. But at least this time, people are finally paying attention. Anaya exhaled, rolling her shoulders to release the tension still coiling in her muscles. She turned toward Pierce. Thank you for handling this, she said, her voice even. Pierce gave her a knowing look. Don't thank me yet, he said. We're just getting started. Anaya arched an eyebrow. What do you mean? Pierce's gaze flicked back toward the now humiliated officers. You're not the first agent this has happened to, he admitted, and I'm done letting it slide. Anaya understood immediately. This wasn't just about her. This was about the entire system, the abuse of authority, the unchecked biases, and the people who had suffered because of it, without the power or the platform to fight back. Pierce turned back to her. We're going to take this all the way to the Attorney General. This isn't just some incident. This is a national disgrace. For the first time that day, Anaya allowed herself to smile. She had come here to stop a cyber attack. Instead, she had accidentally exposed something even bigger, a system that had operated on fear and unchecked power for far too long. And now, that system was about to be dismantled. Piece by piece, the system unmasked. 48 hours later, Washington, D.C. Anaya Carter sat at the head of a long, dark conference table inside a secured government facility. The room was sleek, sterile, and filled with high-ranking officials, people who rarely gathered unless something monumental had happened. To her left sat Special Agent Logan Pierce, his presence a warning to anyone in the room who still underestimated the gravity of the situation. Across from them sat representatives from the Department of Justice, DOJ, Internal Affairs, and the Civil Rights Division. And at the far end of the table, Director Maxwell Bennett, the man who oversaw every federal intelligence agency in the country. The air in the room was thick with tension. On the large monitor behind them, footage from the traffic stop played on a loop. The entire world had now seen what had happened that day, how two officers racially profiled, detained, and humiliated a senior federal operative without cause. More than 8.5 million people had watched the viral video online. More than 100,000 calls had flooded the local precinct in the last 24 hours. And now, the government itself had been forced to act. The briefing that changed everything. Director Bennett finally spoke. His deep, gravelly voice carried the weight of experience, but there was something else in his tone. Frustration. This incident is a national disaster, he stated bluntly. I don't need to tell you how bad it looks when a senior intelligence operative is arrested on false pretenses, on camera, while actively trying to stop a terrorist-level cyber attack. He turned to Anaya. Agent Carter, he said, the President has personally requested a full report from your division. We need to get ahead of this before it spirals further. Anaya leaned forward, locking eyes with him. Sir, she said, this isn't just about what happened to me. Bennett exhaled. I know, and that's exactly why we're here. She gestured toward the monitor, where the footage now showed Henderson mocking her credentials, ignoring clear federal clearance, and calling for backup as if she were a dangerous threat. "This isn't just incompetence," she continued. "It's systemic bias. If this can happen to a high-level national security agent, imagine how many everyday citizens are being mistreated right now with no cameras, no backup, and no one to hold the officers accountable." A beat of silence fell over the room. Then Logan Pierce spoke. "This isn't an isolated incident," he said. "Over the past 5 years, more than 430 complaints of wrongful detainment and excessive force have been filed against that very same precinct." Several people in the room stiffened. Anaya frowned. "And how many of those cases were actually investigated?" Pierce glanced at the DOJ official across from him. "Less than 4%, he said. Anaya clenched her jaw. Less than 4%. That meant the remaining 96% of victims were ignored, dismissed, or silenced. "And let's be clear," she added, "this isn't just about one police department. This is a national pattern." The Civil Rights Division director nodded. "We've seen it before. Officers abusing their power, emboldened by the lack of consequences." Bennett rubbed his temples. "So what do you propose?" Anaya's demand. Anaya sat up straighter. "I want full federal oversight on every wrongful detainment case from the past 5 years," she said firmly. "Every case that was ignored needs to be reopened and reviewed. And I want concrete changes, not just press statements and empty apologies." Pierce backed her up. "We need mandatory bias training, independent review boards for excessive force cases, and a complete overhaul of the reporting system. Officers shouldn't be investigating themselves." The room shifted uncomfortably. A DOJ representative spoke cautiously. "You're talking about restructuring an entire sector of law enforcement." "Exactly," Anaya said. "Because if we don't, nothing changes." Silence stretched over the table. Director Bennett finally sighed. "You realize what you're asking for will cause severe backlash from certain groups." Anaya's eyes flashed. "Let them be mad," she said, "because I'm done waiting for change that never comes." Pierce smirked slightly. "And frankly, sir, we're already past the point of damage control. The public is watching. If we don't act now, we risk losing trust in our institutions altogether." Bennett drummed his fingers against the table. "This is going to be a war," he admitted. "The pushback will be massive." Anaya didn't blink. "Good," she said. "Then we know we're doing something right." The fallout begins. Within 24 hours, multiple officers from the Edgewater Police Department were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Within 48 hours, the DOJ officially announced a nationwide initiative to audit wrongful detainment cases across all major cities. Within 72 hours, Chief Henderson was officially fired and placed under criminal investigation for falsifying reports. And within a week, the first federal task force on law enforcement accountability was created, led by Anaya Carter and Logan Pierce. The system had tried to silence her. Instead, she exposed it to the world. And now, she was going to burn the corruption to the ground. The war for justice begins. 1 week later, Washington, D.C., National Intelligence Bureau headquarters. Anaya Carter stood in the operations center of the newly formed Federal Task Force on Law Enforcement Accountability, FTLEA, watching as data poured onto multiple high-resolution monitors. The air in the room buzzed with urgency. Analysts, investigators, and federal agents worked around the clock, sifting through years of wrongful detainment cases, misconduct complaints, and buried evidence. It was a war room, and for the first time in her career, Anaya wasn't just fighting faceless cybercriminals or terrorists. She was fighting something far more insidious, a broken system that had thrived in the shadows for decades. She glanced at the live feed on one of the screens, a Senate hearing in progress. The footage showed Senator Michael Langston, a veteran politician with deep ties to law enforcement unions, slamming his hand against a podium. "This task force is nothing more than a federal overreach into state policing," he barked. His face flushed. Our men and women in uniform are being unfairly scrutinized. Anaya's lips curled slightly. She had expected this. The system always fought back. Senator Langston looks nervous. Logan Pierce muttered beside her. Anaya crossed her arms. Good. That means we're hitting the right pressure points. Pierce exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. We've been at this a week, and we've already uncovered enough misconduct to bury half the precincts in the country. Anaya glanced at another screen displaying a list of police departments under federal review. The numbers were staggering. Over 4,200 misconduct complaints filed in the past 5 years. Less than 6% investigated. 1,300 officers still active despite serious allegations. And the most damning number, 98% of wrongful detainment victims were from marginalized communities. This is a crisis, Anaya said, her voice quiet but firm. And it's been swept under the rug for decades. Pierce looked at her. You realize they're going to come after us, right? The unions, the politicians, the media. Hell, even some of our own agencies might try to shut this down. Anaya met his gaze. Let them come. The first major crack in the system. That afternoon, Anaya received a message from Julia Monroe, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption. Julia had been digging into Officer Henderson's past, and what she found was far worse than anyone had imagined. At a secure meeting location, Anaya, Pierce, and Julia sat around a dimly lit table as she slid a confidential folder across to them. You're not going to believe this, Julia said, voice grim. Anaya flipped open the folder, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Inside were internal police memos, falsified reports, and sealed records showing that Henderson wasn't just a rogue officer. He was part of an organized cover-up. Jesus Christ, Pierce muttered, flipping through the pages. This goes back years. Julia nodded. Henderson wasn't acting alone. His entire precinct has been operating like a private militia. They've covered up at least 17 wrongful deaths, planted evidence, and illegally detained over 200 people. Anaya's fists clenched, and no one stopped them. People tried, Julia said, but every complaint got buried. The officers who spoke out, they were fired, blacklisted, or mysteriously transferred. The department protects its own. Anaya's stomach churned. This wasn't just corruption. It was organized criminal behavior wearing a badge. This isn't just one city, Pierce said, eyes dark. If we dig deeper, we'll find this in precincts across the country. Anaya looked at Julia. You have proof. Julia smiled grimly. I have everything. Blowing the case wide open. The next morning, Julia's story exploded across every major news outlet. Leaked documents reveal widespread police corruption in Edgewater PD. Falsified reports, secret cover-ups. The truth about Henderson's department. Justice system in crisis. Who's holding the police accountable? The fallout was immediate. Henderson and Dale were officially indicted on charges of obstruction of justice, falsification of records, and abuse of power. The Edgewater chief of police resigned. More than 12 officers were suspended pending investigation. The DOJ expanded the federal probe into other departments with similar misconduct patterns, but not everyone was celebrating. Senator Langston and other powerful law enforcement allies were working behind the scenes to shut down the task force. That night, Anaya received a threatening phone call. She answered, keeping her voice even. Agent Carter. A deep, gravelly voice came through the line. You need to back off, the caller warned, or you won't live to see this investigation through. Anaya smiled coldly. Funny, she said. That's the same thing a terrorist told me last year. A pause. Stay out of this, Carter, the voice growled. This goes deeper than you realize. Anaya's eyes darkened. Then I guess I'll just have to dig deeper. The line clicked dead. She stared at her phone for a moment before turning to Pierce. Well, he said, raising an eyebrow. That didn't sound like a friendly conversation. Anaya exhaled sharply. That was a warning. Pierce smirked. Guess that means we're getting close to the real monsters. Anaya nodded. And now, we take this fight to the next level. The final battle for justice begins. Within 24 hours, Anaya and Pierce requested federal protection for whistleblowers coming forward against corrupt precincts, issued a classified request for surveillance on politicians and officials with deep ties to police corruption, met with the DOJ to push for the largest national audit of police misconduct in U.S. history. But the enemies in power weren't going to go down without a fight. And as Anaya stared at the file in front of her, she knew. This wasn't just about reform anymore. This was a war. A war that would either change history or cost her everything.